It's great to see everyone and some familiar faces and some new faces. So I'd also like to introduce you to Kevin Matheson, who is on the call as well, who's my research assistant. So great. So Kevin just put my bio into the chat if you'd like to look at it. I'm a former Treasury official. I rejoined the Institute about 5 years ago. I was a research assistant at the Institute actually right out of undergrad. So that's why I say rejoin. But in between, I spent about 10 years at the Treasury Department working primarily on Iran sanctions in one way or another across a variety of different roles. And so I've been asked to talk tonight about how do Iran sanctions really work? And this is a huge topic, and it's one that I'm very passionate about. I think I was very lucky when I joined the Treasury Department in 2005 to get the Iran portfolio as an entry-level analyst in their intelligence office. This was a time when the administration and the Bush administration, the US government, was really just starting to ramp up what we call the Iran constriction campaign. Of course, there had been sanctions on Iran for decades. But it was after the finding at the UN that Iran had a clandestine nuclear program, of course, that then the US started going beyond that embargo and over time building up a multilateral sanctions regime, which included, a series of UN Security Council resolutions. Just to give you a little bit of a sense of what my time at Treasury was like, and I say lucky because I'd come into an office that had only been stood up a couple of years before. So it was the kind of place, after you'd been there for about 6 months, you were considered one of the old timers because they were onboarding people so much. But I think my kind of big break as an analyst came when one day I was analyzing a data set of Iranian financial information, and I just found a needle in a haystack. I got lucky. And I was able to put together an Iranian sanctions evasion typology that had not been previously discovered. And Treasury, everything in government is a bureaucracy, but Treasury is probably one of the flattest organizations in that bureaucracy. And it was really exciting. I, pointed this out to my office director, and within a couple of hours, I was briefing it to the undersecretary, who at that time was Stuart Levy, to the director of OFAC, who at that time was Adam Zubin, and the assistant secretary, who was Danny Glazer. I think names that you might be familiar with. I think they've all spoken to the Institute at various times over the last 10 years or so. And it was a really exciting moment. I think I was probably 26 years old, just a year or so out of graduate school to be doing that. And the funny thing was that the assistant secretary of the intelligence division at Treasury had this thing where when you had this kind of information, intelligence information, you had to have an intelligence officer in the room anytime it was discussed by the policymakers. And so this typology that I had uncovered, she assigned me as the person who was responsible for kind of shepherding that information and making sure that it wasn't released before it was actually eventually made publicly available about 2 years later, after we had done a lot of sharing it with financial institutions and foreign governments around the world. But because this was classified information at the time, you couldn't talk about it unless you were in a special room that they call a SCIF. It's for top secret information. So everyone started referring to it as the Kate slide when they were in unclassified areas. And I think this was really my big break in how many of the senior officials of the Treasury Department got to know who I was. All of a sudden they knew my name because my name became attached in kind of a funny way to this piece of information. And so I really, really enjoyed working at the Treasury Department. From there, I went on to serve as the financial attaché in Jerusalem at the US consulate when that was the mission in Jerusalem, and later as the financial attaché in Abu Dhabi, but with responsibility for all of the Gulf states. So I was the only Treasury representative in the GCC. When I started out there, it quickly grew. And I think a number of you probably tuned in to a talk I gave in October where I talked a lot about my experience as a Treasury attaché. So this is an issue I'm very passionate about. And sometimes when I give talks on it, I can really go down a rabbit hole because what I find really interesting is some of the super technical details. So in an attempt to avoid doing that tonight, what I've decided to do is I picked 3 common misconceptions about Iran sanctions. And I'm going to talk through some of those with you, and then kind of very briefly make some quick recommendations on how I think the Biden administration should move forward from a sanctions perspective with Iran. And then we'll have a discussion, and I'm happy to talk about anything that I feel like I can opine on from an expert perspective or my experiences overseas as well. So the first misconception about Iran sanctions is it's easy to put them on, and it's easy to take them off. After all, we had a sanctions regime in place. There was a nuclear agreement. They were off, and then the Trump administration withdrew from that agreement. And they were on again. So now we're looking at the prospect of the U.S. re-engaging with Iran to negotiate either a return to the deal and/or follow-on negotiations that would address a wider purview than just the nuclear deal. So Kevin, if you can go ahead and put up the first slide. This misconception, I think, is even repeated or parroted by the Iranians themselves. So Kevin, when the slides get up, will show you that recently, senior Iranian officials, this is Zarif, who's the foreign minister, said recently that Biden could lift the sanctions with 3 executive orders, the swipe of a pen, because of course the Iranians, their position right now is that they will not return to the table until the U.S. has put sanctions relief in place. And so Zarif and Rouhani and others have argued this is a very simple thing to do. There's no need to talk before you do it. And I think they're looking back when the Trump administration withdrew from the nuclear agreement. That's really what they did, is they put 3 executive orders in place that reinstated the sanctions that had been relieved. I actually wrote or co-authored with Patrick Clausen at the time a policy note where we talked about, right before this happened, all of the options that the Trump administration had. They didn't need to do it this way. There's a lot of discretion within the statutory requirements for sanctions, that they could have done things differently than the way the regime had been set up when the relief went into effect, but they chose not to. It's not straightforward from either a technical perspective or a practical perspective to relieve sanctions. From the technical perspective, the reason why it's not as simple as 3 executive orders and getting rid of them is that there are a number of sanctions the Trump administration put in place since they withdrew from the nuclear agreement that go on top of those 3 executive orders that implemented their withdrawal. And these are specifically new sanctions against key Iranian economic actors, such as the central bank, and the National Iranian Oil Company, the National Iranian Tanker Corporation. Iran as a oil exporting country, of course, needs the Tanker Corporation. They need the oil company to be able to operate globally, and they need the central bank to be able to intermediate those revenues. So if what eventually the Biden administration wants to give Iran under some sort of resumed compliance, of course, on their side, in terms of recommitting to the nuclear constraints that were part of the nuclear deal, if they want to give relief, absent lifting these 3 sanctions, it's going to be there. That isn't going to be relief. Iran won't be able to have their revenues intermediated. They won't be able to do more than they are now in terms of the amount of oil that they're moving around. And the reason why those wouldn't be covered is they were done under counterterrorism authorities. And counterterrorism authorities, of course, the nuclear deal, the agreement was relief from nuclear sanctions in return for adopting constraints on the nuclear program. So these would now be outside the scope. And some have argued that the Trump administration did this in order to put up a sanctions wall that would make it hard for Iran to get relief. What I've been hearing from within the administration is they recognize that there would be a political cost. Of course, Iran and sanctions have actually historically been, there's been a lot of bipartisan agreement on them on the Hill. Most Iran sanctions statutes have been passed, with near 100%, 100 votes in the Senate, for example. And you saw opposition to the nuclear deal on both sides of the aisle as well. So they understand there would be political costs to removing these sanctions, but they kind of understand this is just something that they would have to do. They'd have to give up that political capital. As kind of a sanctions nerd and someone who looks really at the technical aspects of it, these are behavior sanctions. So there are status sanctions, like you can sanction someone for being, there are sanctions on people who work for the supreme leader. So anyone can be listed if they work in the supreme leader's office. That's a status sanction. When you do a behavior sanction, it's based on an administrative record of all of this bad behavior. And I still think, I still see these as having a lot of credibility, even if they were potentially political in nature. If they were able to sanction the Central Bank of Iran because the role they play in facilitating Iran's support, financial support and otherwise, for its proxies, then removing it doesn't make a lot of sense. So they would get a lot of opposition to this. And I think it's going to be very difficult. On the practical side, if you look back, if you look at the quote on the left, this was actually, so when I was preparing for this, I went back to some of the previous remarks I had delivered to trustees in different settings. And I had quoted the Supreme Leader here from this Wall Street Journal article from May 2016 at one of the annual conferences Institute conferences where I spoke on Iran. There was, right around this, it was right after he had said this, that claiming that the Obama administration had only removed sanctions on paper because Iran was still having trouble accessing banking services that they needed for international transactions. And this is the practical side of it. And, I think it's going to be an even bigger challenge to try to piece back together the financial plumbing that Iran needs to have to be able to reintegrate than it was in 2016. The kind of risk appetite of banks have changed. The desire of firms to go back into Iran at this point, I think they've seen that the possibility that policy can change based on who's in the White House means that they may not want to put forward major multi-year investments in Iran and things like that. But this isn't a really important issue for sanctions to work, because if sanctions such as the ones on Iran that are intended to change behavior, if that's the policy objective, which we can talk about whether or not that was the policy objective in the Trump administration, then there has to be this quid pro quo that for a behavior change, they get something. And if we can't put it back together, then, and this is what I said at the time in March 2016, was that my greatest concern about the staying power of the deal, if you put aside the technical issues that were still being ironed out there in terms of did Iran have too much heavy water and things like that, and you put aside the possibility of political transitions undermining it, which of course, this was before the election that saw President Trump come into office, that I thought the greatest concern was Iran not seeing the value of the deal, not getting that relief. And so, stopping its commitment to the nuclear constraints to try to put more pressure on the international community. And so that's why you saw at the time, actually, Secretary of State John Kerry was going around on a tour, sitting down with major banks and governments, trying to explain to them that it was possible to do business with Iran. And Kevin, if you want to move to the next slide, this one, exactly. This was an op-ed by my former boss at Treasury, Stuart Levy, who had left. He was one of the few officials that had stayed on from the Bush administration to the Obama administration, largely because of the major role that he played in Iran sanctions policy. And at this point, he had left, and he was the general counsel at HSBC, based in London. And from there, he wrote this op-ed about this tour that John Kerry was doing to try to get banks to work with Iran again, pointing out that the irony was that many of these same banks had been convened 10 years earlier by senior US government officials to hear about the risks of doing business with Iran. And the fact was that many of those risks remained. Because the deal only affected nuclear sanctions, there were there were other sanctions that remained: terrorism, human rights abuses, sanctions under those sorts of programs. There was also, really I think that the sanctions relief really muddied the waters on the proliferation side as well. I mean, we didn't go into the nuclear deal thinking that Iran was no longer a proliferation threat. That's why there was verification and oversight. And so the message that was seemingly being given to the financial sector was they're not a proliferation threat anymore, even though that was a fundamental part of the deal. But all of the sanctions that would alert the financial sector to who they shouldn't be dealing with were gone, or who they should be more wary of. But the banks knew this, and they knew that there was all kinds of other systemic risk. They knew that Iran was not in compliance with all kinds of international standards on the illicit finance side, the Financial Action Task Force standards, but Basel and FATCA and other things like that. So they found it very disingenuous also that Kerry was coming telling them what to do when under the nuclear deal, US banks still were prohibited from doing business with Iran. So what they were hearing was, you want us to do something you're not going to allow your own banks to do. And so I think this is going to be a big challenge going forward for the Biden administration. Just earlier this week, I was actually asked to write something on the issue of the ways the US could demonstrate seriousness about facilitating Iranian relief in advance. So what kind of outreach program they could put together, even before the specifics of sanctions relief would be discussed, so that they could show the Iranians that they were serious about this. And I said, that's exactly what you shouldn't be doing. Because the fact is that all this risk remains. And as someone who worked at an institution that's a financial regulator, the Treasury Department, you don't go around telling people to ignore the risks that they're set up. I mean, this is what banks do, is they weigh risks. And beyond that, there's the issue that this is exactly the kind of overhang they want to have if the objective is to return to the nuclear deal and then have follow-on negotiations to lengthen the sunsets, to address ballistic missile issues, and to address Iran's behavior in the region. Because absent those significant changes, I don't think you're going to see a lot of business go back. So that was kind of long-winded. I'll try to go through the next two more quickly so that I can leave enough time for discussion. So the next misconception is that the US can just stop enforcing sanctions. And I think part of that I've been talking about already for the last 10 minutes, which is that it's really the private sector, the commercial sector, that implements the sanctions. Without them, there would be no withdrawal of business. There would be no economic pressure generated. And so I put this out there as a misconception because this is also something I've heard, is that a possible Biden administration approach might be to just stop enforcing. But as I've already kind of argued, even if they gave sanctions relief, there's the vast majority of foreign firms aren't going to return to business with Iran. So even if they stop enforcing, that's not going to give the Iranians a lot. But I think the other thing, the reason why people are talking about this is that they think that this is already happening to a certain degree. And I don't agree with that. There's been a lot of noise about Iran wanting access to some of its blocked revenues to be able, in the context of the COVID response, to be able to get medicines and medical devices and buy the COVID vaccine and things like that. And those sorts of transactions are in fact not blocked. There's an exception across sanctions program, not only US sanctions programs, UN sanctions programs for humanitarian trade. Again, this kind of de-risking, which is what is called in the financial sector, where global banks look at some of these areas and say, that's just too complicated, especially under the Trump administration, whereas they saw the policy is fairly capricious. And a real lack of clarity on where it was heading. And it's expensive and time consuming to do the kind of due diligence and compliance work to be able to do even the allowable humanitarian trade. So there is a problem with access to their funds to do the things they want to do. But everything that's been said, and I actually just heard that Tony Blinken addressed this in testimony today that I didn't have a chance to watch. He was asked if the US had allowed access to any of these funds that are in South Korea and Japan, in Oman and other places, and he said they have not and they will not until Iran makes concessions. And of course, the reason there are these pots of money is because one of the stipulations of the nuclear deal, or of the sanctions, both when they were in effect before the deal and when they were resumed initially under Trump, was that Iran could continue to sell its oil, trade with its oil trading partners, as long as those partners kept that money in an escrow account in country and local currency. Kevin, you can take that slide down now. The other concern is that there's a lot of evasion going on in terms of the oil trade right now. And you may have seen that China has been importing record numbers. They're almost exceeded their storage capacity overall. Partially probably because they're taking advantage of lower prices before they go up, which they already have in recent days. But I think the thing to remember when you see news about China trading with Iran is first of all, my analysis is I don't think that that's as big of and as robust of a relationship. It's often overhyped in the media. China wants to be able to trade in the region. They appreciate the U.S. security guarantee. They want to be in the Middle East because it makes sense commercially for them, but they also want their firms to be in the U.S. And I think that you really haven't seen major Chinese firms return to do business with Iran. Even the state-owned firms. And even if there was one sanction against a Chinese entity for trading oil with Iran, where it actually said that this Chinese entity had acted deceptively so that the Chinese government didn't know it was doing it. So I think you have to take a lot of the news about this being a very robust relationship with a grain of salt. But the other thing is Iran's not getting most of that money. If you look at the Iranian statistics, they have set a revenue target for the year, the Iranian year, which ends in a couple of weeks because you have Nowruz, the Iranian New Year. And what they've published is that for the first 9 months of the Iranian year, they have only hit 16% of their revenue target, which was already pretty low from oil sales. So if they're selling record oil to China, where is it going? Well, it's the semantics of the way it's being reported. They may be shipping record oil to China, but they're probably not selling the majority of that. For one, a lot of it is going into bonded storage in China, where it's not a change of ownership. Iran is just putting their oil there in the case sanctions are lifted so they can sell it quickly. The other thing is that under the sanctions going back, prior to 2013, 2012, 2013, that Iran and China made a series of deals where they offset some of the Iranian revenue or foreign exchange reserves, in fact, that were in China by making investments in Iran. And the return on those Chinese investments in Iran is actually in oil. So a fair amount of this is what are called equity barrels. It's the return on the Chinese investment. The other thing is that there is a lot of oil, ending up in China ultimately that's going through Oman and Malaysia before it gets there. And there's costs to that kind of evasion. There's middlemen to be paid. And Iran also has been giving a significant discount on the oil that they've been selling. So that's kind of where it is on the oil and sanctions issue. Just real quick, the third misconception is that Iran got, and this is kind of a big one, so I'm going to try to get through it quickly for discussion, but it is kind of historical, that Iran got $150 billion under the JCPOA. You all may remember hearing that. And there was a lot of politicization of this, and there was a lot of debate about was it really 150 billion, depending on whether you were in support of the deal or you were against the deal. And I think it's important to recall that this was Iranians' oil revenue. This was Iran's money that had been locked up under these sanctions, as I mentioned. But in fact, by the time the sanctions were lifted, a large amount of that was illiquid because of these offsets that they did with the Chinese, for example, because they had to put it in their own state-owned banks to shore them up. And even when the sanctions were lifted, besides the challenges of reestablishing the banking networks, they also had this really big problem with convertibility. Because all of this money had been put in these escrow accounts in local currencies, in the Omani Rial, in the South Korean won, et cetera, and the Indian rupee, these are not fully convertible currencies. You have to go through the US dollar if you want to get to euros or sterling, for example. So what they found is because they didn't have access to the US dollar, it was really, really hard to move this money. And a lot of it remains locked up where it was prior to the nuclear agreement going into effect. So Kevin, if you want to put up the final slide, this is another question that I've gotten from policymakers recently in kind of the context of what would be the value to Iran if sanctions were lifted. So looking strictly here at the amount of money they would get access to, that it's actually probably less than $40 billion. And that's in terms of foreign exchange reserves, that's not a lot of money. So the IMF and the Brian Hook, who was the special envoy for Iran under the Trump administration, have both said that Iran has roughly $100 billion in foreign exchange reserves, but that only 10% of that is accessible. So a lot of analysts have kind of drawn out of that must mean that they have 80 or 90 billion that they would get access to if sanctions were lifted. But in fact, if you look at all the publicly available comments from Iranian officials, as well as officials in these countries listed here, you get nowhere close to 80 or 90 billion. You only get, and actually it's probably less than 40 billion, because as Kevin put this nice footnote in for me, that we did this about a week ago, 7 billion for India. And just this week, there's been news that Iran has already run down all of its rupee reserves. So this, I think, also goes to show that, and this will be kind of my first recommendation for the Biden administration, is not to be too overeager to reach a deal. I think right now there's this perception, especially by some on the left, that the Biden administration isn't moving fast enough to get Iran back to the table. And I think that they probably have wanted to move faster, but the fact is the Iranians have been obstinate. And I think this is what it has enabled is kind of a flipping of the narrative, where under the Trump administration, the US was the kind of the bully that had withdrawn from its own commitments, and created a rift, with especially our partners in Europe, on Iran sanctions in particular, that most recently Iran has said it wouldn't sit down at the Europeans' invitation. And this is, I think it's helpful to have this narrative shifted where it's not the US that's being obstinate right now, and to have that play out for a while. But ultimately, Iran cannot sustain itself for many years to come. It is run down its foreign exchange reserves. It is really struggling. And the COVID crisis has done what sanctions couldn't do, which was shut down a lot of their cross-border trade, which was their non-oil trade that they were trying to build up to supplant what they weren't getting in terms of oil revenue. So my first point of advice would be to not rush. The second one would be to not work too hard to encourage this financial integration, as I mentioned, because you want to have this overhang, and you want to continue to show that there needs to be follow-on discussions. There needs to be extensions of the agreement and incorporation of other issues. And the final one, I would say, would be to continue to use sanctions to highlight Iran's bad behavior. And I think this is a kind of whole other discussion, but Iran's behavior in the region, in particular, the targeting of US forces, support for the Houthis who've continued to target Saudi Arabia, and likewise. And I think what maximum pressure focused on the Trump administration, really in terms of a narrative, was to show that you could build economic pressure, that you could make them suffer, that you could drive up inflation, that you could drive down employment and things like that. And I think, where they should be more so on the narrative is to say Iran is not, not acting as it should in the international community broadly on any of this type of behavior. And when sanctions can be used to highlight that, what you do is you have a better chance of multilateralizing them, of getting the Europeans to take action, maybe getting in, maybe advancing something the UN possibly, even though that's pretty far-fetched at this point, but really building that multilateral sanctions coalition that doesn't just put additional economic pressure in place, because I think we're pretty much maxed out there, but also isolates Iran diplomatically, because I think that was one of the key elements that brought Iran to the table last time. So I'll leave it there for now. And Kevin, can you take down the slide? And does anyone who has the first question? Okay, David.
So can you maybe describe, Kate, the confluence of pressures that you think will have to be forcibly in place that would actually get the Iran regime to at least suspend their desires or efforts for a nuclear program, and how close to that are we?
That's a really good question. Iran was pretty much at that point, leading into the nuclear deal and when it was implemented. I mean, there were very strict constraints on its program, on development of its program, but of course it has backed away from those requirements as well. It's not just the U.S. that is no longer compliant with the nuclear agreement. Iran has, they've enriched beyond the level they were supposed to. They're doing experiments on heavy metals that are prohibited. They adopted this legislation that said that they had to stop cooperation with the IAEA if the U.S. didn't give relief. Kind of thankfully last week, they were able to negotiate an extension of some oversight to kind of avoid a crisis with the IAEA there. The Europeans withdrew some of their complaints because the Europeans, of course, really want to see negotiations go forward. But they have to, I think the first step is really to get to the table to negotiate what I think will probably be a step-by-step process to bring both sides back into compliance. So I think you will see, moderate sanctions relief in return for, certain things that Iran needs time to do. So you might see an offer of some sanctions relief when something is done, and then more, and step by step. And that's not that different from what was done under the JPOA, which was the interim agreement, right? Iran had to ship out its heavy water, it had to dismantle centrifuges, and each time it got a couple $100 million from these frozen reserves, not from the U.S. This was their money. And so I think that's what you're likely to see. And then I think, I do think it's important to see the benefit of the relief, to have it work. And I think the oil sales could pick up. There's interest amongst Indian refineries and South Korean refineries already that you're seeing reported because of the nature of Iranian oil and certain things about it that make it really attractive to them. So I think it's going to be a long process. I don't think this is, I don't really think that you're going to see Iran back in that position within the next year, maybe. But I think that there's a roadmap to get there. I think it's not entirely clear what the Biden administration policy is going to be and how they're going to pursue it. It's still so early in the Biden administration, and there's so many other competing priorities. But I think it's possible to get there, just not in the immediate future. Are there any other questions?
Yeah.
Martin?
Kate, nice to see you again, Kate.
Good to see you too.
Do we really have a good idea as to how much the sanctions have really hurt the Iranians economically, or are we just wishful thinking? They still seem to be financing their proxies all over the place. They're still engaging in weapons development and research and such. So we like to think that we've really hurt them, but are they on the brink or are they doing fine? How do we know?
Yeah, it's funny. I actually got that same question from John McCain in a classified briefing that I did for him in Dubai in about, probably 2012, because it was the same thing then. You were seeing big signs of pressure on the Iranians and very little in terms of the impact it was having on their ability to finance proxies. And my answer then was that Iran's always going to prioritize it. That's always, the regime is likely going to choose funding Hezbollah over purchasing the COVID vaccine. And I think that's something that various administrations in the past have pointed out, and I think that's something we need to continue to point out. I think that's where the Biden administration is going with some of their very strong statements, such as Blinken today, against providing access to these assets before they're back to the table, at the very least. But beyond really where my thinking has evolved since 2012, which I would hope it would, beyond that, I think there's a real kind of over-reliance on thinking that we can put we can put the Quds Force or the IRGC out of business through sanctions. Because they're a huge operation, they have their own, they self-finance in many ways. You know, they're very integrated into the Iranian economy and they control a lot of commercial enterprises. But also, even where you've seen, I think you've seen a greater impact, dollar for dollar, on Iran's ability to finance its proxies under maximum pressure than you did under the previous set of sanctions. But it's also, I mean, it's hard to kind of disaggregate that how Hezbollah is struggling from what's been going on with the Lebanese economy and the Syrian economy and other things. But the maximum pressure sanctions really went after Iran's access to hard currency. It went after all of the sectors that could generate any export income that would be in hard currency. And Iran doesn't just need hard currency to control its exchange rate, to finance its trade, but it also needs it to finance its proxies. Hezbollah is not going to take Iranian rial. They take dollars. They operate, or at least until very recently operated, in a highly dollarized economy in Lebanon. And they paid their salaries in dollars. And what you saw them really struggling to get the dollars to Hezbollah. And you even saw Hezbollah counterfeiting money for the Houthis, that they were having a hard time getting hard currency to other proxies as well. And that's why Iraq has been so important to them, and the Quds Force presence there from a kind of revenue and access to hard currency perspective, because Iraq is very dollarized. And so, there was a lot of funneling money, either that was Iranian money held in Iraq, to Hezbollah and Hamas, or using it there to finance proxies in Iraq. But what you ultimately see, I think, is that even when that funding is cut, that there's still an affinity. I mean, you still see that that these are very close relationships. So even if you can make it harder for the proxies to operate, they're still going to act at the direction of Iran. I think that sometimes that is misunderstood, that you could somehow use sanctions to drive a wedge between them. These are groups that were founded from the very beginning by the IRGC, which is the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps. Hezbollah was basically seeded by Iran. And so you're in the PMF, the Popular Mobilization Fronts, that are Iran-backed, some of the Shia militias, same sort of thing. The affinity is going to be there even if you cut the funding. So sanctions are not a panacea. They have to be part of a policy. And this is really interesting, because I think that the Biden administration, they've said they're going to do a top to bottom sanctions review to look at the efficacy and the appropriateness of the use of sanctions. And I think some people look at that and they say, oh, they're going to use them a lot less, because there's all of these questions of, are sanctions being overused? Is it displacing the role of the dollar? I don't think that's what they're looking at. I think they're looking at, I know a couple things, but what I hope they're also looking at is how sanctions can't be a policy. It has to be a part of a policy. So you're not going to see fewer sanctions, because you're still going to see the use of sanctions determined by China policy, for example, or Iran policy, or even our policy towards Saudi Arabia, because you've already seen them that deploy sanctions in some of these contexts. So I think it's the fact that you need to have diplomacy. You need to have credible military threats or some sort of military deterrence. And that's how you get the really tough issues in kind of a comprehensive manner, not by using sanctions alone. Sorry, that was long-winded.
Thank you.
Does anyone else have a question? Ron.
Figure out how to unmute. This is a really basic question, but do you think the Iranians, I guess, within the supreme leader side, or the political leadership, do they believe that they will ultimately be successful in getting nuclear capabilities? And the US policy on a bilateral basis has been, as long as I can remember, that's an unacceptable outcome, and all options are on the table. So that if there was to be a race towards that, I assume that means that there military action would be taken. But if the Iranians believe that, then they should be I would have thought, much more interested at a rational level in getting rid of the sanctions and trying to come to terms with something. But I'm wondering if they believe with or without sanctions, if they believe ultimately they're going to get to that finish line that they seem to want to get to.
Yeah, I think, what the Iranians would say is that there's a fatwa against the development of nuclear weapons. I mean, that's what they always say, right? Like, they're not pursuing a bomb. That's not where they're going, even though there's indications that of, otherwise. They did agree to these constraints under the nuclear deal when it was in place. But of course, there were sunsets to those. So that was a lot of the concern, that they were biding their time in order to do that. I think at this point, what they're doing in terms of withdrawing from those constraints, increasing enrichment, other things like that, is they're really trying to create leverage. I don't think the maximum pressure sanctions were effective. They didn't get around to the table, but they created a lot of pressure. And I think before Iran returned to the table, they want to feel like they've created their own leverage as well. From a political perspective, I think that's where they kind of need to put themselves. So I mean, that doesn't really answer the question of do they think they're going to get there ultimately. But I do tend to think that that's not necessarily where they're headed right now. I do think there's the possibility of giving them back to the table. And I do think the idea of getting them to agree to compliance and then pursuing follow-on agreements, which would extend sunsets and put constraints on ballistic missiles and things like that, is probably the best approach right now to capitalize on what the dynamics are. I mean, this is not 2015. It's not going to be the same negotiations. The dynamics in the region aren't the same. And there needs to be further discussions than just the nuclear deal.
Thank you.
Just want to understand where the Europeans fit in. How supportive are they? Where do they, because they're closer to Iran, they're closer to the Middle East. And because everything is better if we work in cahoots with our allies, because it's certainly not China and Russia. And I just don't know what kind of negotiations or communications going on, not just financially with regard to sanctions, but with regard to having more of a united front to address these other issues that are important in addition to nuclear proliferation, et cetera. But I just don't really understand where the Europeans stand on all this.
Yeah, so even going back, to the early 2000s, to the Bush administration always saw that you couldn't untangle Iran's behavior in the region, support for proxies and things like that, from the nuclear program. And the Europeans always looked at it differently, that if you had a nuclear Iran, everything else would be more difficult, and that you should address the nuclear program first. There's also a very strong feeling in Europe that the best way to get Iran to change on other issues is to engage in economic diplomacy and strengthen commercial relationships. And so I think that is why the Trump withdrawal from the deal was so difficult, and also because there were negotiations between the U.S. and the Europeans at that time to try to begin negotiations on ballistic missile issues. And so I think this is why you hear this is one of what will probably be the first next thing after there would be some return to the deal, is because I think there's a feeling kind of on all sides that there is an area of agreement on constraints, even by the Iranians, where they could put some sort of constraint on ballistic missiles, at least in terms of how far, the range of them. They couldn't develop ICBMs, for example. But in Europe, everyone's distracted right now as well. Every government has a lot going on responding to the COVID crisis. Domestic radicalization, economic issues, things like that. And I think the European approach, even over time, has been that they want to be more conciliatory towards other governments or other issues in the region, because they don't want to see the spillover of those, on their doorstep, because they're closer. So they're not going to be as aggressive on Syria. They're not going to be as aggressive on Lebanon, and Hezbollah's involvement in the government there and things like that. But but I think they really want to see a return to the deal. It's very important to them. They're very concerned about the nuclear acceleration, and they kind of towards the end of the Trump administration, I would talk to European officials and they'd be like, does no one notice that like the breakout time is diminishing every day? Why is the Trump administration only talking about, you know, Iran's support for proxies? I mean, there really was a kind of, you know, the switch to the other side so far in the Trump administration that they barely talked about the nuclear issue. And we're much more concerned about everything else that Iran was doing. And the Europeans were just kind of like, I don't understand. Why isn't anyone watching? Like their eyes not on the ball. You know, Iran's marching towards a bomb. So I think they really want to work together with us on this. And it's I think as I said before, I think that you've seen this change in narrative, which has a lot to do just with the change in administration. But that Iran is now the one in the wrong. And what I would like to see is really some good. You know, I'd like to see some multilateral sanctions. I'd like to see the European designate some Iranians who have engaged in assassinations in Europe, which they've done a little bit of, but like more of that. I'd like to see them go after Hezbollah fundraising, which that's probably, you know, they'd have to designate Hezbollah as a terrorist organization first. But I think all those things are more possible when we're working together on the nuclear issue. Yeah, David. Or was there anyone else? Let's see, you're still muted. Go ahead, Bill. You're still muted.
Oh, okay, here we go. Thank you. So if I can peel the question back a little bit further, my fear is that unless the Iranian economy is so deteriorated that the regime can't pay the IRGC and Quds Force to defend the regime against an insurrection of its own people, it will still have the nuclear program under development in some manner. That's my fear, that's the precipice, that's the only precipice that would keep them from changing their behavior. Can you just kind of respond to that? Because it seems like we're a long way away from something like that.
Yeah, I mean, we are a long way away from that. What we're actually much closer to is probably, you know, there's Iranian elections, presidential elections coming up in June. They'll start their campaign season in a real way. They have a very short campaign season. They'll start it right after the Nowruz holiday. So kind of at the end of this month, actually more like the beginning of next month. But you already see some of the campaigning now. And that's another reason to be kind of wary of what you're reading headlines, Iranian officials saying this and that, because a lot of them are going to be candidates. And so they're saying different things because they're trying to develop their platform and put it out there before they're allowed to officially campaign. But it's very likely that you're going to see someone very closely affiliated with the IRGC come in as president. And so, you know, when you're talking about defending the government, the IRGC no longer defending the government from the protesters, actually the government and the IRGC might be, you know, virtually one and the same. But it just doesn't seem like the protests are there yet, where, you know, you could really see them rise up. You know, people are unhappy, life is difficult, inflation is very high, unemployment is a real issue. They've had a very serious case of COVID in Iran, very high levels of infection, but the public, I don't think, is there. So I don't think you're going to see that dynamic anytime soon. I think what you kind of just have to you have to see that, you know, the nuclear deal and any deal going forward is going to have a lot of verification and oversight involved in it, and that intelligence plays a big part too. And of course, we learned a lot from the Israeli information that was released about Iran's program previously, but I have a lot of faith in our ability to know if that other stuff is going on and to be able to get the IEA. I mean, right now it's not a question of us not knowing what they're doing, really. It's a question of us not having the ability to constrain it, and to get them back within the limits that were set before. So yeah, I think that you kind of have to think that the intelligence and the constraints are going to be effective. I don't know if you're, I can't tell over Zoom if you're still skeptical or not.
Barbie has a question.
Okay, Barbie, go ahead.
You got to unmute yourself, Barbie.
How big a factor are the Houthis? And they are a factor as far as Saudi Arabia is concerned. They have been attacking Saudi Arabia and affecting them. And I want to know what kind of a factor they are. And regarding David's comment, they have, I keep hearing different amounts of time that they have to come to a weapon, that they are within 3 days, 3 months, 4 months. And do we have any better understanding than that? Because I think they're people, they say, have not got a leader, and that's why they haven't successfully erupted, that there's not one factor, one leader. Could you answer us about those several questions?
Yeah, so I can try to give responses to both of those, but when I look at those two issues side by side, I actually think my colleague Elena Delosier is the real expert both on the nuclear cycle and on Yemen. But what I've learned from her, or maybe relearned, because I actually started my career out at the Department of Energy, in terms of the breakout time, yes, there's a lot of different numbers out there. What's kind of important that I've come to appreciate from hearing Elena describe this is that the breakout time is only the time to which they would have enough enriched material to be able to build a bomb. That weaponization of that is still really technically difficult. One of the concerns about one of the things they're doing right now, which is experimenting with metals that they say have I think medicinal applications. This was prohibited by the deal because it's knowledge building for what they would need to do in order to take the enriched uranium and make it into a warhead. And that we don't know if they have that knowledge, if they know how to do that. So even if you say that the breakout is 3 months away, which is, I think, one of the numbers that's out there. I think that's the number the US government is using. I'm trying to remember if that's the Israeli or the US one, but that just means they'd have enough material, and then they would need to weaponize it. And so breakout is really the point at which you start getting very worried, but it doesn't mean that they would have a bomb that day. And Elena gives a really good presentation on all of these technical nuclear things that I've seen her do a couple of times. I don't know if she's on the agenda to do one of these policy chats, but she really explains it in a manner that's easy to digest. On the Houthi in Yemen, I think that over the last, I'd say 18 months or so, Yemen has been seen by some as the low-hanging fruit. That this is something we could solve, and it could create some sort of momentum for dealing with Iran and other regional issues more broadly. And I think that this goes back to, maybe it's more than 18 months. Time gets a little foggy in the COVID period. You're sitting in your house every day. But the last time I was in Europe, this is what I heard from French officials, is they really wanted to know what they could kind of do to put more economic pressure on the Houthi in particular, thinking that this was something that they wanted to be able to solve. And I think we heard the same thing, Reagan and others who were in Saudi Arabia, what is that now, almost 3 or 4 years ago, that the Saudis were very eager to end the war then. And I think they continue to be eager to do that, but they have to be protected. And the proliferation of missiles by Iran to the Houthi is big of a concern and we heard the Saudis present it this way as well, as the proliferation of precision-guided missiles to Hezbollah is for Israel. So they're not just gonna withdraw from Yemen until they can protect themselves, but I think there's a lot of different sides that want to wrap things up there. And I kind of suspected that the Biden administration might really push hard on Yemen to begin with, because it's been seen that way. It's not as intractable as Hezbollah in Lebanon yet. So they may want to try to address that first. I think Elena would argue that it's actually, like everything else, really, really complicated with lots of different international players. And so you can't really call it low-hanging fruit. But I think that's the hope of some policymakers. So I hope, Barbie, that answered your question. And I hope that your grandson, Andrew, I hope he's doing well. I used to work with him a little bit when he was at FDD, right across the way from us. But I haven't spoken to him in quite a while. So it's very good to see you. And I hope that answers your question. I think that we're about at the end of the hour. Dan, you're the MC. I'll let you tell me if I can take more questions or if we're going to wrap it up here.
I think we'll wrap it up here. If anybody wants to ask Kate any further questions, they can email her. You can email me. I'll forward it to Kate.